Hello and welcome once again to Speakeasy, where we focus on people in the public eye. Continuing with our series, Crisis Areas in World Politics, is Dr. John G. Stoessinger. And today's topic is Soviet Russia inside the Enigma. And Dr. Stoessinger, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm going to start right away with a very pointed question. President Reagan said not too long ago that the Soviet Union is the source of all evil in the world. I would like your comment on that, please.
Not a very helpful statement, I might say. I think the Soviet Union is a heavy-handed, retrograde, bureaucratized dictatorship. It makes deserts wherever it goes. But having said that, we have to negotiate with the Soviet Union over many issues, particularly arms control. And to say that about Russia is not a particularly constructive statement. Now, I would argue that I think it's an old Indian proverb that said, "May God grant me the gift not to pass judgment on someone because before I have walked in his moccasins." So one has to understand the Soviet Union and how they feel about us. Let me, for example, try to put on a mask here for a moment and pretend that I'm Mr. Andropov, or a Soviet leader in the Politburo, and ask you some questions and see what you would say about it. For example, supposing I'm Mr. Andropov and I would say, you know, you Americans, when the Bolshevik Revolution took place in 1917, you sent American soldiers to the Pacific coast of the Soviet Union and tried to overthrow the revolution, right from its very beginning. And then you Americans, when we were bleeding in the Second World War and we were fighting the Nazis, we lost 20 million people in that war. Stalin begged you many, many times to take the heat of us and to create a second front, asked you Americans to create a second front in Western Europe. And you promised us, and you postponed that second front from 1942 to 1943, and from 1943 to 1944. Why did you Americans do such things? So how would you answer those questions?
That would be very difficult to answer.
Well, they are difficult to answer. What I'm merely pointing up here is that the truth is very complicated. And simply to say, we are all nice guys and they are all bad guys is an unhelpful and unconstructive statement. The truth is really very, very complex on things like that. And before one understands the Soviet Union, one really has to study it, and before one judges it, one has to understand it. So I would recommend that Mr. Reagan, for example, and many Americans like he, read some good books about the Soviet Union before judgments of this kind are made.
What about his making a visit to the Soviet Union? At least making an attempt?
Well,
he's never been there.
No.
He doesn't know very much about it, and yet he makes statements like this.
That's right. Usually you find that when you get to know your opposite number, so to speak, across the negotiating table, by visiting his country, and by getting to know its culture and its history, you become less judgmental. It doesn't mean that you have to become any less firm in your attitude toward it, but you become more, if you will, receptive to other cultures and other ideas. And you're not so quick to pass judgment on another culture. Because if you start from the point of departure that you guys are bad and we are good, then there's almost no hope of any kind of agreement. Because if you believe that someone is your enemy long enough and hard enough, in the end you will be proven right, you see.
And he doesn't know much about the people themselves, about the Russian people.
I don't think so.
He still has the Cold War attitude toward the Soviet Union.
I'm afraid so. It goes right back to the 50s. Now, actually, I've been to the Soviet Union many times. I'm no apologist for it by any means, but I know the country. I know the people. I've lived there. I've lectured there. And actually, when you walk down the streets of Moscow, Leningrad, Irkutsk, or even Vladivostok, The differences are great, but I think the similarities in many ways are even greater. They are just as afraid to be blown up by an atom bomb as we are. And if you interview the ordinary Soviet citizen on the streets of a large city, you discover that their fear of us is just as great as our fear of them. They will tell you, you know, you Americans have this arms race going. You build all these bombs, and you usually build them before we build them. You built the H-bomb first, and you built the ICBM first, and you built the MIRV first, and you built the MX first. We just follow you. Why do you do this? And that's also difficult to answer. Again, I'm not apologizing for them. I'm trying to show what it looks like from the other side, because very few Americans have that view. Let me give you another example. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, for which I have no apology, by the way, it was an act of outright naked aggression. We broke off the negotiations with them over the SALT II treaty, which was an arms control treaty. Now, I think that was a mistake. It was like saying, we're doing you Russians a favor by talking arms control with you, while in fact that should be a question of mutual survival. When I discussed this with a Soviet official, he said, you know, all right, so we invaded Afghanistan, and we have 150,000 troops there, but you Americans, back in the 60s and 70s, you had 500,000 troops, whom you sent 10,000 miles away to Vietnam. And
still signed the treaty.
Precisely. In May 1972, when you Americans were bombing Hanoi and were mining the port of Haiphong, Mr. Nixon and Mr. Kissinger were in Moscow at that very moment negotiating the SALT I treaty. We didn't cancel it. We signed it with you. So how come you cancel SALT II because of Afghanistan?
That's a very good point.
I think it's a good point. And again, I'm not making these points, you see, to apologize for the Soviet Union. I don't like the Soviet government any more than the typical American does. But unlike the typical American, I'm prepared to understand them so I can cope with them more intelligently, instead of these shoot-from-the-hip type judgments which the President has made and which, in my judgment, don't help at all. Don't help at all the cause of peace.
Then President Reagan doesn't see where communism might have changed somewhat or might be in a state of flux. He still has that 1950 version of communism, because I think it has changed. It is changing in the Soviet Union, as we said it was changing in China in our last program.
Right. Let me give you some examples. When Stalin was alive, Stalin ran the Soviet Union for 25 years, from 1929 to his death in 1953. Now, in that time, there was no such thing as a dissident. If you opposed the Soviet government, you got a bullet in the head. If you read a book like Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, for example, it described that horrendous period of Stalin's zenith of power. At that point, the secret police was in the ascendancy. Stalin purged the Communist Party. He purged the military. He engaged in forced collectivization of peasants. He herded millions and millions of people into gulags, into labor camps and concentration camps. Now, that has to some degree improved. Today, at least, you have dissidents. You do have the Solzhenitsyns. You do have the Sakharovs. They don't get shot. They get exiled or put under house arrest, which is not exactly terrific, but it's an improvement over what was true 20 or 30 years ago. Now, the Communist Party in Russia is still in absolute control. The KGB, which Andropov ran for 15 years, is still the eye and ear of the Communist Party.
Well, let me ask you something, if I can interrupt you for 1 minute.
By all means.
Who decided that the Soviet Union would be the center of communism? Because Karl Marx was a German Jew, and now Russia is really the center, really this patriarchal figure of communism. How did this happen?
You know, I have to laugh because I have the hunch that many Americans don't know that Karl Marx was not a Russian. They seem to forget that Karl Marx was a German Jewish intellectual who wrote his books over 100 years ago, and who never in his remotest dreams believed that Russia, of all countries in the world, would run the communist movement.
And I don't think it's anything now the way he pictured it
He
then.
would turn over in his grave 100 times.
I didn't want to say that, but that's what I meant.
There's no question about it. Now, there is nothing in Marx's books which says that Russia should lead communism. The Russians stole the movement. To be precise, Lenin did. In 1917 and 1918, he brought the communist movement to Russia, set it up there, set up an international network of communist parties, which he called the Communist International, or Comintern, and then simply asserted that the Soviet Union is the center, the citadel of world communism. Stalin inherited it, consolidated it, and somehow for 50, 60 years, nobody in the communist world ever even questioned it. When Stalin sneezed, every communist got pneumonia. You know, the first communist who ever questioned this at all was Tito in Yugoslavia in 1948. And that was already decades after the Russians stole the movement. And Tito got away with it and outlived Stalin for a quarter of a century. Now, you know, to get to your question...
Oh, didn't he win the support of Truman because of that?
Absolutely. Truman was very smart about this, by the way. He said, here is a communist. His name is Tito. He's a Yugoslav communist, but he doesn't like the Russian communists. So I like him, I'm going to help him. And that's exactly what he did. This is precisely, you see, what Mr. Reagan hasn't done, is to distinguish among various communists by saying some are light gray, some are dark gray, not all of them are black and evil and the source of all evil in the world. There's a lack of sophistication, a lack of nuance in that kind of policy.
Well, in light of what we see happening in Poland today, is this a reflection of Russia losing its power as the center of communism?
Absolutely. The most important person in Poland is the Pope. It is not General Jaruzelski. And the fact that the Poles are loyal, if you will, to the papacy, and 90% of the population of Poland is Catholic, is a thorn in the flesh of the Kremlin and of the Soviet leadership. Now, the Poles, you see, can't do very much about it. They are in a very difficult geographic situation between Germany and Russia, which has been tragic for Poland's history for many decades. But if you go to Poland today, you will hear often very nice humor, because that's all they can do. You see, they can't take on the Red Army. So you often hear humor. For example, let me give you one instance. A recent Polish story was, the question was asked, what is the definition of a string quartet? Answer, the Leningrad Symphony Orchestra after a tour in the United States. That's a string quartet. You want another one? I'll tell you another one.
Why not?
All right. Andropov has a conversation with Konstantin Chernenko, who is the nominal prime minister of the Soviet Union. And he says to Chernenko, listen, he says, Konstantin, if all this keeps up, if there are so many émigrés who want to leave Russia, so many people who want to leave the Soviet Union, who want to go abroad to the United States and to Israel, etc., there'll be no one left but you and me. Chernenko says, don't count on me. You know. So,
latest jokes out of Poland.
Poland, Czechoslovakia, I know dozens of others of these things. The main point is that the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Romanians are sick and tired of defining a communist as someone who obeys the Soviet Union.
Well, as long as we've taken a slight comic relief break, let me interject something here, if I may. Thank
Surely.
you. I would just like to give our viewers the address of the program where they can write to you, if that's all right.
It certainly is.
Questions and comments that they have for you or for me. And they can write to Speakeasy. That's Post Office Box 2596, Rockefeller Center Station, New York 10185. And that will roll on the screen again at the end of the program if you missed it. Thank you for letting me do that. Now, if you could continue, please, with this, the new view of Poland and Russia, vis-à-vis Russia.
I was trying merely to point out, you see, that if today Mr. Andropov or anyone running the Soviet Union would call a meeting of the Communist International, of the network of communist parties throughout the world, who would listen? Who would show up in Moscow? Maybe the
You mean
East
if they
Germans?
gave a communist party, nobody would come?
A few would come. The East Germans would come. Maybe the Albanians would come. Maybe the Bulgarians would come. And that's about it. So what? The Chinese hate their guts. The Romanians are on their own track. And much of Eastern Europe is slowly wriggling out of the Soviet fold, because they have suddenly discovered, 60 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, that Marx was not a Russian, and that this whole thing is ridiculous, and that, in effect, they want to lead their own communist parties without the blessings of the Soviet help. Now, this is the most important development in the communist world, that the Russians are losing control and they don't quite know what to do about it.
What do you think they would do in a case like that? They know the power is slipping away.
All right, let me answer that. That's an excellent question.
Is it the case of Poland an example?
Let me do it for you chronologically and then come up to Poland.
All right.
The first time that you had a revolution, really in recent years, in your lifetime, was Hungary, 1956. Now, so long as the Hungarians did not challenge the Soviet leadership of the Hungarian Communist Party, they let them get away with it. But then when the Hungarian foreign prime minister, whose name was Imre Nagy, said, I want to be neutral, like Austria. I don't want to get any more Russian leaders in here. At that point, Nikita Khrushchev, who led the Soviet Union in those days, sent the tanks to Budapest and crushed the Hungarian Revolution.
Put an end to that.
Similarly, 11 years later, 12 years later, in Czechoslovakia, 1967, 1968, so long as Alexander Dubček, who was the General Secretary of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, did not question the Soviet-Russian leadership of his own party, they let him get away with it. But one day when he said, in the so-called Prague Spring, let's have lifting of censorship here, let's have an opposition party to the Communist Party, at that point, Brezhnev sent the tanks to Prague. In other words, the litmus test which the Russians have used is to say, so long as you play around, we let you play, but never question the absolute supremacy of the Soviet Communist Party over you. And that's what these people are tired of now. That's what the Poles are tired. Now, Poland, you see, is not Czechoslovakia, and Poland is not Hungary. That was different. So let me explain Poland now. There was, to the best of our knowledge, a very serious discussion in Moscow what to do about the Solidarity Union. You see, again, so long as the Solidarity Union was an economic union, looking for higher wages, the Russians tried to look the other way. But then Lech Walesa said, we should have free election in the Solidarity Union. Now that was something unheard of in the Soviet Union, a free election.
Then why wasn't he quieted immediately?
Well, you see, the Russians know that the Poles would fight, possibly. They always lose, but they always fight. This is no Czechoslovakia, this is no Hungary. So there was a discussion. They said, all right, let's see how far this goes. Then Lech Walesa said, not only do we want a free election in the Solidarity Union, we want to go further. We invite our brothers in other unions in the East Bloc to do the same. At that point, the Soviet leadership set a date of crushing the Polish Revolution. Now here they had a dilemma. On the one hand, there were some in the Soviet Politburo said, let's invade them, let's send the tanks in, the way we sent the tanks to Budapest and to Prague. But then the opposition in the Politburo said, if we do that, we might lose tens of thousands of Red Army people. Those Poles are going to fight, there'll be a resistance there, there'll be a guerrilla war, this might become our Vietnam. Besides, these crazy Americans might not trade with us anymore. It's the end of all relationships with the West.
Those were worries that they didn't have about Hungary and Czechoslovakia.
Right. On the other hand, they said, if we let the Poles get away with this freedom business, free elections, you see, then this infection called freedom might spread back to Czechoslovakia, back to Hungary, maybe even to the Ukraine and to the Soviet Union itself, so we have to do something here. So what they did is to take the middle road. They trained themselves a Russian-trained Polish general,
Mr.
General
Jaruzelski.
Jaruzelski, who became the cat's paw, the instrument of the Soviet tyranny to be reimposed on Poland. And every time Lech Walesa sort of comes out of the woodwork again, they crush him again, in the hope that if they do this long enough and hard enough, the West will get fatigued about all this and look the other way, which is a melancholy commentary.
You don't think Walesa has proven his point, that he's not about to disappear that quickly?
I think he has proven his point, but what can the poor man do?
But this puts Russia against the wall, doesn't it?
It puts Russia against the wall, but only up to a point, because, you know, Stalin once said, how many battalions does the Pope have? You see, now the Pope has the Catholic Church behind him, but the military power still sits on the Russian bayonets, unfortunately. And so long as they are there, you see, one has to be very, very careful indeed. There was this terrible incident in Hungary when John Foster Dulles said, we want to roll back the Iron Curtain. And the Hungarians said, great, the Americans will help us if we rise against the Russians. And then, when the Russians invaded Hungary, poor Imre Nagy, the Hungarian, said, America, help us, what can you do for us? And John Foster Dulles just said, well, we just meant moral help. Now that was a big help, you see. So now the problem is, of course, you better not talk too loudly, because if you do, you have to follow through with deeds. And therefore, looking at this terrible experience that we helped precipitate in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, now the American government has tended to be rather quiet and limit its actions to food embargoes and economic embargoes. The embargoes and the food sanctions are not working very well. Let me, in fact, make a point about that. I don't believe that embargoing Poland with food is very helpful. I would have suggested, for example, something far more sophisticated. One might perhaps approach the Pope and say, supposing the Pope instruct the Catholic clergy in Poland to become the distributors of American food, relief food in Poland. I would like to see that Communist Party member in Poland who would have the nerve to stop a Polish parish priest from distributing American food shipments to his parish. In other words, this would be a case where humanitarianism and Machiavellian strategic considerations...
I thought that was being done to some degree.
Not really. Not really. You know, the Red Cross gets in there a little bit, but in essence, we ship very little stuff to Poland now. The Russians, on the other hand, send in their trucks with bread. So we get the reputation of being the guy who is miserly, who doesn't send in things, while Big Brother from the East in the Soviet Union sends in the goods.
You know, we only have a few more minutes left, unfortunately, Dr. Stoessinger, and there's something I do want to ask you. This sounds as if Russia has always been a massive communist empire. And this is not the case, if I can remember my history.
It was a Tsarist empire, too.
Yes.
Always a dictatorship.
But I mean, at some point it was a democracy. Wasn't it 6 months in the early 20th century? I remember a name, Kerensky.
You happen to be quite right.
And I don't think too many people know that Russia was a democracy very briefly.
You're right. In February of 1917, when the Tsar abdicated, during the First World War, you had a 6 months interlude, the so-called provisional government, during which a democracy actually reigned Russia, under a guy whose name was Alexander Kerensky.
Yes.
Now, Alexander Kerensky ruled Russia for 6 months until he was overthrown by Lenin in the famous October Revolution. It's funny that you should mention that, because, believe it or not, I met Alexander Kerensky once. When he was a very, very old man in his 80s, you see, he fled Russia across Europe and wound up in New York City.
You met him here in New York?
I met him in New York City when he was 80 years old. I gave a speech someplace, and up came an old gentleman, introduced himself, and said, my name is Kerensky. And, you know, I was stunned, of course. And I said, Excellency, you mean you were the Prime Minister of the Provisional Government of Russia? He said, yes, he was. And he said, you know, I have to ask you a question. Do I have time to tell that story?
We have a couple of minutes
left. A couple of minutes. I'll try to make it fast, because it's humanly interesting. You see, what happened then was that Kerensky fought in the First World War on the side of the United States, France, and Britain against Germany. And he promised Woodrow Wilson, who was our president, to stay in the war. Lenin, on the other hand, in the underground of Russia, trying to capture the population, said, if you bring me to power, me, Lenin, I will take Russia out of the war. Kerensky was an honorable man and kept his promise to Wilson. So I couldn't help but ask this question of Kerensky, who was standing in front of me, a frail old man. And I said, Excellency, if you would do it over again, would you have kept Russia in the war? Or would you have stolen the thunder from Lenin and taken Russia out of the war, which was the popular position then, because Russia had already bled itself white 3 years in the war. And that poor man, right in front of me, began to weep. He didn't know what to say. And 6 months after that, he died.
That was the dilemma then that had plagued him his whole life.
Oh, certainly, because, this is one of history's unanswered questions. Because Lenin had the popular position. He sensed with his tremendous nose for the popular will that getting Russia out of the war would get him to power.
And if Kerensky hadn't been so loyal, things might have been different.
That raises a very profound philosophical question, you see. In other words, sometimes what should you do? Should you do something dishonorable, perhaps, in order to get a larger, honorable goal? It's a very tough question. It's the old question, do the end justify the means?
The moral question.
The moral question.
That plagues us forever. Dr. Stoessinger, this has been an absolutely fascinating topic.
Well, thank you.
And I think that a lot of our viewers are much more well-informed now than they were before.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for being with us. For Speakeasy, this is Janis Lasser.